At 2300 hours on October 24, 1942, Private First Class Robert Mitchell pressed his back against the muddy wall of his fighting hole and listened to the jungle breathe. He had been ordered not to fire, not yet, not until the Japanese were so close he could see their faces in the darkness. The order terrified him. Mitchell was 19 years old, from a small town in Kansas where the closest thing to combat he had seen was his father hunting deer in the Flint Hills. Now he crouched in a hole on Guadalcanal, 500 yards south of Henderson Field, waiting for 3,000 Japanese soldiers to walk into a trap. He gripped his M-one Garand rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. His finger rested outside the trigger guard, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to shoot. The waiting was worse than combat. In combat, fear became action. Training took over. Muscle memory replaced thought. But waiting gave a man time to think, time to imagine all the ways he could die, time to wonder if he would break when the moment came. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mitchell could hear them now. Not clearly, not yet, but somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the tree line, thousands of men were moving through the jungle. He heard branches snapping, equipment rattling, voices calling out in Japanese. They were not trying to be quiet. They were confident. Why would they not be? The Japanese had defeated every enemy they had encountered since December 1941. They had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. They were the masters of the Pacific. Tonight, they were walking into hell, and they had no idea. The tactical situation was deceptively simple. Henderson Field, the crude dirt airstrip that had become the most valuable piece of real estate in the South Pacific, was defended by a thin perimeter of Marine positions. The perimeter was only as strong as its weakest point, and every officer on Guadalcanal knew where that weakness lay. A narrow corridor of relatively flat ground ran from the jungle south of the airfield straight to the runway. It was covered in kunai grass, with scattered palm trees and patches of swamp. Tactically, it was a natural avenue of approach. Any attacking force would use that corridor because moving through the thick jungle was nearly impossible at night. Visibility in the jungle was measured in feet. Units became disoriented, lost, separated. Coordinating an attack through jungle darkness was a nightmare. But this corridor offered relatively open ground where troops could maintain formation, where officers could control their men, where 3 battalions could advance together toward their objective. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Burwell Chesty Puller had identified that corridor 3 days earlier. Puller was 34 years old, a career Marine officer with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He had been commissioned in 1918, too late to see combat in World War I, a disappointment that had haunted him ever since. He had spent the 1920s and 30s in Haiti and Nicaragua, leading patrols against bandits, learning jungle warfare the hard way. He had earned 4 Navy Crosses before World War II even started. Puller was not a large man, 5 feet 9 inches tall, but he radiated authority. His jaw was square, his eyes were hard, and his voice could cut through artillery fire. His Marines called him Chesty because of his barrel chest and the way he carried himself, shoulders back, chin up, like he owned whatever ground he stood on. They followed him because he led from the front, because he shared their hardships, because he had never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. On October 21st, Puller had walked that corridor south of Henderson Field. He studied the terrain with eyes trained by 2 decades of combat. He saw immediately what any attacker would see. This was the path of least resistance. This was where the Japanese would come. He returned to his command post and met with his battalion staff. "This is where they will hit us," Puller said, stabbing his finger at the map. "Right here. They will come straight up this corridor at night when our air power is grounded. They will try to overwhelm us with numbers and reach the airfield before we can stop them." His officers studied the map. The corridor was 600 yards wide, and ran for nearly a mile from the jungle to the airfield perimeter. Defending it would require significant forces. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had only 500 effectives after weeks of combat and disease. They were stretched thin across thousands of yards of defensive line. Concentrating forces in the corridor would leave other sectors dangerously weak. "We do not have enough men to defend the entire corridor," one officer said. "If we spread out to cover it all, we will be too thin. They will punch through somewhere." Puller nodded. "We are not going to spread out. We are going to concentrate our forces and let them come to us. We are going to turn this corridor into a killing zone." He outlined his plan. The Marines would establish a defensive line across the corridor, anchored on both flanks by machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery and mortars would be pre-registered on the entire length of the corridor. Forward observers would be positioned with the infantry, ready to call in fire missions. The critical element was fire discipline. The Marines would hold their fire until the Japanese were within 50 yards. Not a shot would be fired before then. Not a single shot. 50 yards? An officer asked. "Sir, that is point-blank range. They will be right on top of us." "Exactly," Puller said. "We are going to let them think they have achieved surprise. We are going to let them think we do not see them coming. When they are so close they cannot miss, and we cannot miss, we are going to open up with everything we have: rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery. Simultaneously, every weapon firing at the same time. We are going to pour more lead into that corridor in 5 minutes than they have ever seen in their lives. We are going to stop them cold." It was a dangerous plan. If the Marines fired too early, the Japanese would take cover, disperse, and use their superior numbers to flank the defensive positions. If the Marines waited too long, the Japanese might overrun the fighting holes before defensive fire could stop them. The timing had to be perfect. The fire discipline had to be absolute. Every Marine had to trust that his buddies would hold their fire, that the plan would work, that opening up at 50 yards would be enough. Puller spent the Marine next 2 days preparing his defences. He positioned his 5 companies in depth across the corridor. The front line consisted of 3 rifle companies dug in along a low ridge that ran perpendicular to the corridor. Behind them, 2 companies were held in reserve, ready to counterattack if the Japanese broke through. Machine guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Every gun had alternate positions prepared in case they had to displace under fire. Artillery forward observers from the 11th Marines moved to the front lines with their radio equipment. They registered their guns on reference points along the corridor, measuring distances, calculating elevation and deflection corrections. When the time came, they could call in fire missions without hesitation. The guns already knew where to shoot. Mortar crews dug their pits behind the front lines, stacking ammunition within easy reach. They also registered their weapons, dropping ranging rounds during daylight to mark their targets. Puller walked the entire defensive line, inspecting every fighting hole, checking fields of fire, emphasizing the importance of fire discipline. He told his Marines the same thing at every position. "Do not fire until you get the order. I do not care if they are standing on your fighting hole. You do not fire until I give the word. When I give that word, you kill everything in front of you." The Marines understood what he was asking. It went against every instinct. When the enemy approached, you opened fire. You engaged at maximum effective range. You forced them to take cover. You disrupted their attack before it reached your position. Puller was asking them to do the opposite. He was asking them to let 3,000 Japanese soldiers walk up to their positions without firing a shot. He was asking them to trust him completely. On October 24th, Japanese reconnaissance patrols probed the Marine perimeter. They moved cautiously through the jungle, searching for weak points, trying to identify defensive positions. Puller ordered his Marines not to engage. "Let them look," he said. "Let them think we are not here. Let them think this corridor is lightly defended or undefended. Let them commit their forces here." That evening, As the sun set over the jungle and darkness fell across Guadalcanal, Puller gathered his company commanders. They met at his command post, a sandbagged dugout behind the front lines. Puller stood in the center, his commanders around him. He spoke without notes, without hesitation. They are coming tonight. Intelligence reports indicate at least 3 battalions, possibly more. They will attack after midnight when they think we are sleeping. They are going to march straight up that corridor because it is the easiest route to Henderson Field. We are going to let them come. We are going to let them walk right into our position. When they are at 50 yards, I will fire a green flare. That is the signal. When you see that flare, you open up with everything. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery, everything at once. Kill them all. The officers nodded. They returned to their companies and passed the word. Do not fire. Wait for the green flare. When you see it, kill everything in front of you. The message spread through the defensive positions. Marines checked their weapons, loaded their rifles, set their ammunition within easy reach. They dug their fighting holes a little deeper, improved their fields of fire, and waited. Private Mitchell had listened to his squad leader explain the plan. His squad leader was a corporal from Texas named Jim Hawkins, a lean man with sun-darkened skin and calm eyes. Hawkins had been in combat before. He had fought on Tulagi. He had seen what happened when Marines panicked and broke. He gathered his squad around him and spoke quietly. This is going to be hard. You are going to see them coming. You are going to want to shoot. Do not. If you fire early, they will give away our positions, and they will spread out, and we will not be able to stop them. We need them bunched up. We need them close. When Chesty fires that flare, you work your rifles like your life depends on it, because it does. 8 rounds, reload, 8 rounds, reload. Do not stop until they are all dead or running. Questions? Mitchell had no questions. He had fear, doubt, and a sick feeling in his stomach, but no questions. He returned to his fighting hole and waited. The hours crawled past. The jungle was never silent. Insects buzzed, night birds called, the wind rustled through the kunai grass. But beneath those normal sounds, Mitchell began to hear something else. Movement. Large groups of men moving through the jungle. The sound grew louder, closer. At 23:30 hours, the Japanese emerged from the tree line. Mitchell saw them as shadows at first, dark shapes moving against the slightly lighter sky. Then more shapes, then hundreds of shapes. An entire battalion stepping out of the jungle and forming up in the corridor. Officers barked orders in Japanese. Units fell into formation. Bayonets glinted in the starlight. They were 300 yards away. Mitchell's heart hammered in his chest. His hands shook. He pressed himself against the side of his fighting hole and forced himself to breathe slowly. Do not fire. Wait for the flare. Do not fire. The Japanese began to advance. They moved in waves, shoulder to shoulder, in a formation that would have been suicidal in daylight but made sense at night. Stay together. Maintain unit cohesion. Advance toward the objective. Their officers walked at the front, swords drawn. They were coming straight toward the Marine positions. 250 yards. 200 yards. Mitchell could see them clearly now. Individual soldiers, their faces invisible but their forms distinct. They carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Some had light machine guns. Others had grenades hanging from their belts. There were so many of them. They filled the corridor from edge to edge, a human wave rolling toward the Marine defenses. They were talking now, calling to each other, confident they had achieved surprise, confident the Americans did not see them coming. 150 yards, 100 yards. Mitchell could hear their footsteps now, the sound of hundreds of men walking through grass. He could hear their equipment rattling, canteens, ammunition pouches, rifle slings. They were not trying to be quiet. They thought they had already won. One officer called out an order. The formation adjusted slightly, units dressing their lines, maintaining formation as they advanced. 75 yards. Mitchell could see faces now. Young faces, some with mustaches, some clean-shaven. They looked eager. They looked confident. They had no idea 500 Marines were crouched in fighting holes 50 yards ahead, fingers on triggers, waiting for a signal. 60 yards. Mitchell's finger moved to his trigger. Not yet. Wait for the flare. 55 yards. The Japanese were close enough that Mitchell could see the expressions on their faces. They were smiling. They thought they had surprised the Americans. They thought they would walk right into Henderson Field without opposition. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 50 yards. A green flare arced into the night sky above Puller's command post. It hung there for a moment, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield, illuminating the Japanese formation in stark detail. For one frozen second, the Japanese soldiers looked up at the flare, confused, wondering what it meant. Then, the Marine line erupted. 500 Marines opened fire simultaneously. The sound was like the end of the world. M-one Garand rifles cracked in rapid semi-automatic fire. 30-caliber machine guns hammered out 600 rounds per minute. Browning automatic rifles poured out sustained bursts. Mortars thumped, sending shells arcing over the front lines to explode among the rear ranks of the Japanese formation. Artillery shells screamed overhead and detonated in the corridor, massive explosions that threw bodies into the air. The effect was catastrophic. The leading ranks of the Japanese formation simply disappeared. Men fell in waves, cut down by rifle fire before they could react. Machine gun fire scythed through the formation, red tracers reaching out into the mass of humanity and tearing it apart. The Japanese had been advancing in tight formation, shoulder to shoulder, presenting the densest possible target. Every bullet found flesh, every burst dropped multiple men. Mitchell fired his M-one as fast as he could work the trigger. 8 rounds, the distinctive ping as the empty clip ejected, reload, 8 more rounds. He did not aim at individuals. He aimed at the mass of men in front of him and fired. He could not miss. There were too many targets. He saw men fall. He saw them stumble and collapse. He saw them try to run and get cut down. He reloaded and fired again. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Men who had been advancing confidently moments before now dove for cover, scrambled for the ground, tried to crawl away from the wall of lead pouring into them. But there was no cover. The corridor was open ground. The kunai grass was too short to hide in. The few palm trees were shredded by machine gun fire within seconds. Men who tried to crawl were hit from multiple directions as overlapping fields of fire caught them. Puller had positioned his machine guns perfectly. Each gun covered a sector. Where one gun's field of fire ended, another began. There were no dead spaces. Every inch of that corridor was covered. A Japanese soldier who moved 3 feet to escape one machine gun crawled directly into the fire of another. The killing zone was complete. The artillery fire was devastating. The forward observers had pre-registered every section of the corridor. They called in fire missions without hesitation, walking shells back and forth across the Japanese formation. 105mm howitzer shells exploded among the rear ranks, throwing bodies 20 feet into the air. The Japanese could not advance through that curtain of steel. They could not retreat either. Men who turned to run were cut down by their own officers or caught by artillery fire. Japanese officers tried to rally their men. Mitchell saw one officer standing in the middle of the corridor, waving his sword, shouting orders. He was incredibly brave. He was also incredibly visible. A dozen Marines fired at him simultaneously. He fell. Another officer stood up, tried to lead a charge toward the Marine positions. He made it 5 steps before machine gun fire cut him down. Another tried. Another fell. Without officers, the Japanese attack dissolved into chaos. Small groups of soldiers tried to charge the Marine positions. They were motivated by courage or desperation, or simply the instinct to close with the enemy and get out of the killing zone. They ran forward, bayonets fixed, screaming battle cries. They were cut down before they covered 10 yards. Bodies began to pile up in front of the Marine positions. The dead created obstacles that the living had to climb over. But climbing over bodies made them targets. More men fell, more bodies piled up. The mortar fire was continuous. Mortar crews fired as fast as they could load shells. The tubes glowed hot. The crews wore gloves to avoid burning their hands. Shells rained down on the corridor at a rate of 15 per minute. Each explosion sent shrapnel scything through the air, cutting down anyone within 30 feet. The combined effect of rifle fire, machine gun fire, mortar fire, and artillery fire created a zone of death that nothing could survive. The Japanese tried to flank the Marine positions. Units, on the edge of the formation, attempted to move around the flanks to get out of the direct fire and attack the Marine line from the side. Puller had anticipated this. He had positioned reserve companies on both flanks with orders to engage any attempt at flanking. When Japanese troops tried to move around the left flank, they ran into a company of Marines dug in and waiting. Machine gun fire ripped into them. They fell back into the killing zone. The same thing happened on the right flank. The Japanese were trapped. They could not advance. They could not flank. They could not retreat. They could only die. The firing continued for 30 minutes without pause. 30 minutes of sustained, concentrated fire. Marine riflemen fired until their barrels were too hot to touch. Machine gunners burned through ammunition belts so fast their assistants could barely keep up. Mortar crews fired until they ran out of shells, then hauled up more ammunition from the rear and fired again. Mitchell lost count of how many clips he had fired. His shoulder ached from the recoil. His ears rang from the noise. His eyes burned from the smoke. But he kept firing. Targets were everywhere. Every time he raised his rifle, there was someone to shoot at. Men trying to crawl away, men lying wounded, men still trying to charge forward. He fired until his rifle was empty, reloaded, and fired again. At midnight, the Japanese attack stalled completely. The survivors crawled back toward the tree line, dragging wounded comrades, leaving their dead behind. They had lost all unit cohesion. They were no longer an attacking force. They were individuals trying desperately to survive. The Marine fire slackened as the targets disappeared back into the jungle. Puller ordered his men to hold their positions and reload. He expected a second wave. The second wave came at 0100 hours. The Japanese had regrouped in the jungle and formed a new assault force. This time they knew the Marines were there. This time they knew what they were facing. But they had no choice. They had been ordered to take Henderson Field, and they would try again. The second wave emerged from the tree line at a run. They did not form up. They did not advance in neat ranks. They charged straight at the Marine positions, screaming, firing rifles from the hip, throwing grenades. The Marines opened fire again. The same devastating wall of lead. The same interlocking fields of fire. The same pre-registered artillery. The second wave lasted 15 minutes before it broke. Fewer men made it back to the tree line this time. The corridor was filling with bodies. The smell of blood and powder smoke hung in the humid air. Flies were already gathering. The Japanese tried a third wave at 0200 hours. This wave was smaller. They had fewer men left. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, terrified. But they came anyway. Duty demanded it. Honor demanded it. Their officers demanded it. The third wave lasted 10 minutes. It broke apart under the same concentrated fire. Men fell in the same killing zone that had claimed their comrades. The bodies piled higher. The corridor had become an abattoir. At 0300 hours, the surviving Japanese withdrew deep into the jungle. They left behind more than 1,800 dead and wounded. 1,800 men out of 3,000. 60% casualties in less than 4 hours. It was one of the most lopsided engagements in Marine Corps history. As dawn broke on October 25th, the Marines climbed out of their fighting holes and looked at what they had done. The corridor was carpeted with bodies. They lay in rows where the initial volley had cut them down, They lay in piles where artillery had caught them trying to take cover. They lay scattered across the kunai grass where they had fallen while trying to crawl away. Some were dead, others were wounded, crying out for help in Japanese, begging for water. Marine corpsmen moved among them, treating the wounded who would accept help. Many Japanese wounded refused aid. Some tried to detonate grenades when corpsmen approached. Others simply turned away and died. Mitchell walked forward slowly, his rifle ready, checking bodies. He had never seen so much death in one place. He had never imagined this is what war looked like. The bodies were twisted, broken. Some were missing limbs. Others had been torn apart by artillery. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, excrement, burned flesh. He felt his stomach heave. He turned away and vomited in the grass. He was not alone. Half the Marines were vomiting. Even veterans who had seen combat before were shaken by the sheer scale of the carnage. Puller walked the battlefield that morning. His face was impassive. He showed no emotion. He inspected the Japanese dead, checking their unit insignia, identifying which battalions had attacked. He made notes for his after-action report. His Marines watched him, looking for some reaction, some sign of what he was thinking. He gave them nothing. Finally, he turned to his officers and said simply, "Good work. Get the men some chow and let them rest. We may have to do this again tonight." But they did not have to do it again. The Japanese did not attack again. They had lost more than half their assault force in a single night. Their battalions were shattered. Their officers were dead. Their soldiers were demoralized. They had walked into a trap that defied everything they knew about warfare. They had attacked with superior numbers against a smaller defending force and been annihilated. From the Japanese perspective, the battle was incomprehensible. They had achieved tactical surprise. They had identified a weakness in the American perimeter and exploited it. They had attacked at night, when American advantages in firepower should have been negated. They had advanced in proper formation with proper discipline. Everything had been done correctly according to doctrine. But the result had been catastrophic. Japanese survivors struggled to explain what had happened. Intelligence officers questioned them in the following days. The reports were consistent. The Americans had not fired until the Japanese were at point-blank range. Then every weapon had opened up simultaneously. The volume of fire had been beyond anything they had experienced. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and artillery had created a storm of steel that nothing could survive. Officers had been killed within the first minute. Units had lost cohesion immediately. There had been no chance to maneuver, no opportunity to use infiltration tactics, no way to close with the enemy. One Japanese officer later wrote that the Americans had lured them into a killing zone and then slaughtered them like cattle. Another said the Marines had fought like demons, showing no fear, giving no mercy. A third said the defensive fire had been so intense and so coordinated that it seemed impossible for human beings to have created it. The Japanese High Command reviewed the reports and drew troubling conclusions. American defensive tactics had evolved. American firepower had proven decisive. American Marines would not break under pressure. The tactical lessons from the battle were clear. Puller's plan had worked because of three factors. First, perfect fire discipline. Every Marine had held their fire despite overwhelming instinct to shoot. They had trusted their commander and waited for the signal. That discipline had allowed the Japanese to advance into the killing zone without taking cover. Second, perfect coordination of fires. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery had all fired simultaneously at pre-registered targets. The Japanese had been hit from every direction at once. There had been no way to escape. Third, perfect defensive positioning. Puller had correctly identified the avenue of approach and concentrated his forces there. He had not tried to defend everywhere. He had defended the one place that mattered. The American victory had strategic implications. The Japanese offensive toward Henderson Field had been a major effort involving multiple battalions and significant resources. Its complete failure convinced Japanese commanders that recapturing Guadalcanal would require far more troops than previously estimated. The battle also demonstrated that American Marines could defeat Japanese forces decisively in defensive positions. This was important psychologically. In late 1942, many American commanders still doubted whether their troops could match Japanese soldiers in combat. The battle proved they could. For his leadership during the engagement, Puller was awarded his 5th Navy Cross. The citation praised his brilliant anticipation of enemy intentions and his masterful defense of a critical position. It noted that his tactical dispositions and fire discipline had resulted in the destruction of an enemy force more than 6 times larger than his own with minimal friendly casualties. Puller accepted the decoration without ceremony. When asked about the battle, he deflected credit to his Marines. "They did what they were trained to do," he said. "They held their fire, and when the time came, they killed the enemy. That's what Marines do." Mitchell received a battlefield promotion to corporal. His squad leader, Corporal Hawkins, recommended him for his steady performance under fire and his discipline in following orders. Mitchell continued fighting on Guadalcanal for 3 more months. He participated in subsequent battles along the Matanikau River and during the final Japanese withdrawal in February 1943. He survived the war, returned to Kansas, married his high school sweetheart, and worked as a schoolteacher for 37 years. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would say only that he had done his duty and that he was proud to have served with Chesty Puller. Puller continued his legendary career. He went on to command the 1st Marine Regiment during the Battle of Peleliu, where he led his regiment through brutal fighting in the Umur Mountains. He later commanded Marines during the Korean War, earning his final Navy Cross at the Chosin Reservoir. He retired as a lieutenant general in 1955 and died in 1971. He remains the most decorated Marine in history. The corridor south of Henderson Field, where the battle took place, was never officially named. Marines who fought there called it different things. Some called it the Death Corridor, others called it Puller's Alley. Still others referred to it simply as the place where they came. Veterans who returned to Guadalcanal decades later could still identify the exact location. The terrain had not changed. The corridor was still there, still covered in kunai grass, still running from the jungle toward where Henderson Field once stood. Walking that ground today, it is difficult to imagine the carnage that occurred there. The jungle has reclaimed everything. No fighting holes remain. No markers identify where the Marines defended. No monuments commemorate the 1,800 Japanese who died there. Nature has erased the evidence, but the shape of the land remains unchanged. The corridor is still the natural avenue of approach. Any military officer walking that ground would immediately identify it as the obvious axis of advance. Puller saw it in October 1942. The Japanese saw it too. The difference was that Puller prepared for what he knew was coming. The battle demonstrated principles of defensive warfare that remain relevant today. Identify the enemy's most likely course of action. Concentrate forces at the decisive point. Coordinate all available weapons to create mutually supporting fields of fire. Maintain fire discipline to draw the enemy into the killing zone. Execute the ambush with overwhelming violence. These principles worked at Guadalcanal. They have worked in every subsequent conflict. They will continue to work because they exploit fundamental characteristics of human psychology and the physics of projectiles. The men who fought in that corridor carried the memory of that night for the rest of their lives. Veterans' reunions brought survivors together decades later. They shared stories, honored fallen comrades, and reflected on what they had experienced. Some spoke about the fear of waiting while the Japanese approached. Others spoke about the shock of seeing so many men fall so quickly. All spoke about the pride they felt in having held their positions and followed orders despite overwhelming instinct to shoot early. One veteran said the hardest part was not pulling the trigger when the Japanese were 100 yards away, knowing they could have stopped them earlier, knowing they were letting them get closer. But he also said the plan worked because they waited. If they had fired at 100 yards, the Japanese would have scattered and flanked them. At 50 yards, there was no time to scatter. At 50 yards, the killing was instantaneous and complete. Another veteran said he never felt prouder to be a Marine than when he saw that green flare and every weapon fired simultaneously. The discipline, the coordination, the trust in leadership, all of it came together in that moment. He said they had trained for months, had practiced fire discipline, had learned to trust each other. That night, all the training paid off. They were not 500 individual Marines. They were one weapon with 500 fingers on 500 triggers, all pulling at the same instant. The Japanese dead were buried in mass graves south of Henderson Field. There were too many to bury individually. Work parties spent 3 days digging large pits and filling them with bodies. The work was grim. The tropical heat accelerated decomposition. The smell was unbearable. Marines wore cloth, masks soaked in oil to filter the stench. They worked in shifts, digging, dragging bodies, covering them with earth. It was necessary work, but it haunted the men who did it. Some had nightmares for years afterward. The battle also had a profound psychological effect on Japanese forces throughout the Pacific. Word spread quickly among Japanese units that a major attack on Guadalcanal had been destroyed with catastrophic losses. The specific details varied in the telling, but the core message was consistent. American Marines had annihilated a much larger Japanese force in a single night. This contradicted everything Japanese soldiers had been taught about their superiority in jungle warfare and night combat. It raised troubling questions about American capabilities and Japanese vulnerabilities. Some Japanese commanders began to question whether their doctrine needed revision. Night attacks had been a cornerstone of Japanese tactics since the war in China. Infiltration, surprise, close combat in darkness, these were methods that had worked repeatedly. But at Guadalcanal, they had failed spectacularly. The Americans had adapted. They had developed countermeasures. They had turned Japanese strengths into weaknesses. The battle also demonstrated the importance of leadership at the battalion level. Puller's tactical acumen had been crucial. His ability to read terrain, predict enemy actions, and position his forces accordingly had made the difference between victory and disaster. If Puller had dispersed his forces to defend the entire perimeter thinly, the Japanese would have broken through somewhere. By concentrating his forces in the one place that mattered and executing a perfect ambush, he had achieved a decisive victory with minimal casualties. Marine doctrine evolved based on lessons learned from this and similar battles. Emphasis was placed on identifying key terrain and concentrating forces there. Fire discipline became a critical training focus. Officers were taught to resist the urge to engage at maximum range when holding fire would create a more devastating ambush. Coordination between infantry, machine guns, mortars, and artillery was refined and standardized. The techniques developed at Guadalcanal would be used throughout the Pacific War and beyond. The 500 Marines who defended that corridor represented the best of American fighting forces. They were volunteers, trained to a high standard, led by experienced officers, and fighting for a cause they believed in. But they were also young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, far from home, scared, tired, and hungry. What made them effective was not superhuman courage or physical superiority. It was training, discipline, and trust in leadership. They had been taught to follow orders even when those orders seemed insane. They had been taught to trust their officers even when the situation looked hopeless. They had been taught that fire discipline wins battles. When the moment came, they applied their training. They held their fire. They waited for the signal. They executed the ambush perfectly. The result was one of the most lopsided victories in Marine Corps history. The story of that night at Guadalcanal is not merely a tale of tactics and firepower. It is a story of endurance, courage, and the quiet strength that emerges when ordinary men are pushed beyond the limits of fear. Beneath the thunder of naval guns and the rattle of machine fire, what truly determined the outcome was not the caliber of weapons, but the caliber of the men who wielded them. The battle was as much psychological as it was physical, and victory depended on discipline, trust, and leadership forged through months of relentless training and shared hardship. For the Marines at Guadalcanal, fear was not an abstract emotion. It was a constant companion. The darkness of that tropical night was alive with sounds, footsteps, whispers, the distant crash of surf, the click of metal on metal. Every sense was stretched taut, every heartbeat amplified. Yet within that tension lay the essence of discipline. Each man had been trained not just to shoot, but to think under fire, to move when instinct said freeze, and to trust that the man beside him would do the same. That discipline was what transformed fear from a paralyzing force into a sharpened edge. Training gave them that strength. The endless drills, the shouted commands, the punishing marches through mud and heat, those moments built reflexes that would save lives. In the chaos of battle, there is no time for conscious thought. Actions must be automatic. The Marines at Guadalcanal did not need to wonder what to do when the first shells landed. They knew. They had rehearsed every movement, every fallback, every call for ammunition or aid. In those critical seconds when hesitation meant death, training became instinct, and instinct became survival. But training alone could not sustain them. Trust bound them together. In combat, trust is more than camaraderie. It is the certainty that the man next to you will not falter. It is the quiet confidence that no one will run, that everyone will hold their ground no matter what comes through the smoke. The Marines who fought that night were not fighting alone. They were parts of a living chain, each link dependent on the others. In the flickering light of tracers and flares, that trust was visible in every action, the quick hand that pulled a comrade to cover, the steady voice that cut through confusion, the shared glance that meant, "I've got you." Leadership was the final element, the invisible hand guiding all others. True leadership at Guadalcanal did not come from rank alone, but from presence. Officers and non-commissioned men who had trained, eaten, and suffered with their troops earned authority that no title could grant. When the enemy attacked, it was those leaders who stood exposed, shouting orders, rallying, men, refusing to yield. Leadership meant calm in the storm, direction amid chaos, and faith when all seemed lost. The Marines followed because they trusted not just their leaders' commands, but their courage. These qualities, discipline, training, trust, leadership, were as relevant in 1942 as they are today. The tools of warfare have changed, but the human heart has not. Technology can amplify strength, but it cannot replace courage. Strategy can win battles on paper, but only people win them in reality. Every generation that faces danger must rediscover these same truths, that preparation is power, that unity is strength, and that leadership is responsibility. The night at Guadalcanal reminds us that history's great victories are not accidents of chance, but the result of character and commitment. The men who stood their ground in that jungle did so not because they were fearless, but because they had learned to master fear. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite it. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War, stories of courage, sacrifice, and endurance that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories and help us preserve them for future generations. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.